You're listening to Give Yourself Some Leeway with me, your host, Eugene Lee. I spent the last 4 years trying to discover how to break the burnout cycle. And as a high achiever in a fast-paced world, it's very easy to slip back into old habits that leave you feeling overwhelmed and left behind. If you're anything like me, then you need to hear this. It's not your fault. Each episode is dedicated to help break the stigma around mental health in the workplace, end burnout culture for good, and the action steps that you can take today to do your part towards your personal growth and success. I am so happy that you're here today, and thank you again for joining us. Simon, welcome to Give Yourself Some Leeway, and thank you so much for taking the time to join the show today.
Eugene, thanks for having me. I'm really looking forward to doing this with you today. I think this has been in the pipeline for quite some time, so it's great to finally be here and having a chat about men's mental health, burnout, and everything in between.
Yeah, I think some of these, like 6 months, just kind of, or up to a year. Sometimes it's just trying to follow up or trying just scheduling that episode after the chat. It's like, oh yeah, but our schedules, and then but we do have to set those boundaries as well. I think that's part of it. Taking a leaf out of our own books and trying to find those boundaries. But when it comes to you experience burnout also, and it's great to get men on the show to share their experience with burnout because not a lot of people speak about their experience with burnout. So what was that like for you?
Yeah, it was horrendous to be completely honest with you. So to give some context, I have lived experience of mental illness for over 3 decades. I can't believe I say that. It's a long time to live with things like obsessive compulsive disorder, depression. I've experienced anxiety, but it all came to a head, say, 2020. So I'm not sure if anybody remembers 2020 and what happened in 2020. If you don't remember, just going to give you a heads up, it was COVID. But it was 2020. COVID was happening. I think in Australia here, we had a lot of lockdowns. So we were locked down for months and months and months on end. Some of the longest lockdowns, I think, in the Western world in Australia. So managing that as well, we had two kids under three. So I've got two little ones. I was studying a master's degree in social work part-time, so in my spare time, which whenever that was. And in my day-to-day job, I was also working in a full-time high-pressure environment. And I remember the day that burnout came into my life was a day where I was struggling with my caseload. So I was sitting here in my home office. We'd been here for a few months, and my manager called me and said, Simon, what's going on? Like your workloads are getting longer and longer to complete. What are the barriers? Essentially, yeah, putting the spotlight on my work. And I remember for the first time ever, outside of my wife, I burst out crying to another person, and the phone went silent because I think it threw my manager off as well. It's like, what's going on? Simon doesn't cry. Like, this is a bit unusual. Um, and I said these words. I said, I think I'm burnt out. And I'd never said those words before. I didn't really know what burnout was. But that started, I guess, a period of getting some help and some healing and recovery, discovering mindfulness in that process, and it ultimately led to me really pivoting my life's course, like actually realizing that the life I'd been living for the 4 years in that job, but also the 30 years, prior, my whole mental health story, things needed to really drastically change. And so it really turned from a moment of pain, and over the next couple of years after that, turning that pain into purpose, which is what I do now as a men's therapist and also a mental health advocate and someone who loves talking about my story of mental illness and burnout, just to inspire other guys, particularly to go, you know what? I can feel things, I can get vulnerable, I can start to be authentic, and that's a good thing as well. And so that's it in a nutshell. It was a moment in time in 2020 that was a combination of my history, but also where I was at the time, and also, I guess, a desire or need or an internal burn that saw me change my life's path. Yeah.
And like hindsight is 2020 when you look back now and you're like, oh, that's what led to my burnout. But when you, let's say, when you had that moment with your manager where you felt burnt out, was it an instant awareness that everything is catching up with me? Or were you, let's say, just blaming what was in your environment around you at that time? Was it, it takes a lot more soul searching to actually realize, well, this has been happening a lot longer than I thought.
Yeah, no, the hindsight definitely came later on, and during my therapy and my recovery, and even like now, as a couple of years on, I'm still, I think, processing or unpacking some of that. At the time, it was just like I think it was a realization that things had just all come to a head, and I couldn't do it. And to give some context to that as well, like I was working in a high pressure environment. I also had the high pressure of the work, of the study that I was doing, the high pressure of the young family, the COVID stuff. Um, and I'd become very cynical of the world, and I was drained, I was exhausted mentally, physically, emotionally, I was exhausted. And part of my OCD, so obsessive compulsive disorder, there's a way that I manage it through perfectionism. And a lot of people that experience burnout talk about perfectionism. And for me to manage the OCD, to manage the anxiety, I set a really high bar for myself and a really high bar for other people in terms of their professionalism, their behavior, etc. And for many, many years, I could jump up and hit that bar and in fact jump over that bar and be this, or at least in my head, this perfect person who could do no wrong. I was very much a rule follower, and I would do what I needed to do to get jobs done. And I actually had a lot of pride in doing things quickly as well. So it got to a point where I could no longer jump up and touch that bar of perfectionism anymore. I just felt like I was going nowhere in my life, particularly in my career. I wanted change. I didn't know how to really get change, and I was studying for change, but it didn't really become crystal clear until I experienced the burnout and going, you know what, I desperately need this change. It's not something about that I'm just doing for the sake of doing. It's actually something that I absolutely need for me and my family as well. And so it was a combination of all those things and a real, but as you said, the realization that I just couldn't keep going the way I was going. But fortunately, the recovery process, the therapy, the mindfulness, and I guess finishing my degree and moving into a small business has enabled me to reflect back on that and go that it wasn't just that moment in time. It was a combination of all those things that I talked about, particularly I guess, the obsessive compulsive disorder, which drove this perfectionism for so long. And also, I guess, the masking of my mental illness through 25 plus years or so of alcohol use and using alcohol to numb things and to feel normal and to get through every week, which is what I ended up being, doing with my drinking. All these things I recognize needed to change, but I haven't unpacked fully yet, but I'm still unpacking. And it's been a few years now. It's what, 2024 when we're recording, and so that's what, 4 years later that I'm still unpacking it and still remembering things that come up and dissecting that. But I find there's healing in sharing the story. So every time I do come on a podcast or do it on my own podcast or even in my own therapy clinic now or my own therapy sessions because I'm a therapist in therapy, um, I find that the more we talk about it, the more I talk about it, the better I feel about it. Because initially, when I started talking about my burnout story, I'd get really triggered and it would bring up a whole lot of badness and fear and frailty that I'd never really experienced. Even though I've got all these other mental health conditions, I'd never broken down in front of a therapist or a manager or anybody except for my wife. So to do this in a very public way with my manager and all of a sudden recognize or realize that I have to take off this mask that I was okay, this mask of mental illness, I call it. Um, it was a powerful thing to go through, and I'm so glad I did go through it. And I am thankful that COVID happened because it all brought everything that needed to come to a head to a head. Because if I'd kept going the way I was going, things would have got a lot worse for me, my family, my relationships with my friends, and all sorts of things. And in a way, as much as COVID sucked for a lot of people around the world, I think it was something that shone a light on mental health discussions, particularly. And I think it has enabled some guys out there, not all guys, guys still struggle with this, to say, you know what, I'm not doing okay. I need some support. My mental health isn't great.
Yeah. When it comes to, let's say, that moment you experience burnout and you looking back now, you're saying that's what led you to embracing change. It was that rock bottom moment where you realized, okay, I have to change. It was like a springboard. That's where you need to, it was your opportunity to change. But a lot of people I've noticed, they have this positive psychology where they're like, if it wasn't for my burnout, I wouldn't realize that I need to change, and they almost use it as a pivot moment. That, yes, it's framing it in a good light, which is great, but at the same time, others look at it as, oh, I need to reach that burnout point before I change. And it's like they'd rather, let's say, work up to that moment where they completely burn out and then make the change. But I I can't emphasize how much, like, if you could avoid that moment, in all that pain, all that discomfort before making that change, why do people feel that need to wait until they hit such a level of discomfort before embracing that mindset to change or to grow?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a great question. And as you were saying, asking the question, I was reflecting on my journey, and I'd been on a process of change for 8 years prior. So it was 2012 that I finally, found that courage to talk about my mental health, and that was going to my wife and my GP and then a psychologist. Before that, it was 20 years of silence and struggling in silence and trying to outthink my mental health conditions and outdrink my mental health conditions. So I'd been on a process of change for about 8 years, but I never really took that out of first gear. It was always first gear. I'd go to a therapist or I'd take some medication and just hope that somebody would heal me, that this would be the magic cure for what was going on. But it was burnout that was really pivotal to make me go, you know what? I need to work more on myself. I need to make life changes. But I think it comes back to, particularly for guys, and I guess we'll focus on guys, is pride. I think a lot of pride on maybe being the breadwinner in their families, or maybe pride that, I'm strong, I'm tough, I can get through things. And in fact, society encourages it these days. We don't work necessarily 9 to 5 in our jobs anymore. They're jobs that go 24/7. And we've just about to pass law in Australia here, which is called the Right to Disconnect law, which enables employees to go home and actually be at home and not have their bosses contact them. So we've got ourselves into a state, around the world where we're always working, and I think that's a pitfall or a downfall of consumerism, of capitalism, where everything's about money and growth and economics and all that type of stuff, and we've forgotten how to disconnect, and so it's almost become a bit of a badge of honor how much we can grind. And we watch social media, for example, and it's all these people grinding and they're hustling, and we had to have side hustles during COVID, and we had to make lots of money and do it like exponentially and all this type of stuff. There's a lot of pressure on us, from a society level to perform. And for guys, particularly, who maybe they're the ones that they're the sole income earner for their household. Maybe their partners, I'm a dad, so maybe their wives are staying home or their partners are staying home and looking after kids. So they've lost an income. So they've got this pressure on them to do that. Or maybe masculinity is coming into this thing, saying, you know what, I'm okay. I'm going to grind through this. I can get through this. I'm going to bury all my emotions and fears and worries away with either just hard work or drugs or alcohol or other addictive behaviors. But eventually, burnout creeps up and catches all. It doesn't discriminate. Burnout is one of those things that, and mental health conditions as well, these things don't discriminate. It doesn't matter who you are, what you are, where you're from, what money you make, what position you are in a business. I talk about burnout with CEOs to the grassroots people, and I was a grassroots, employee. Um, it doesn't discriminate, and I think we need to recognize that our environment and the context of our environment. So that, and this is where the social worker comes out of me, is really important to understand. So when I tell my burnout story, I always say the mental health story. I always say the family story, the study story, the work story, the COVID story, because these are all part of my context of when it happened. And I think we need to start reflecting more on that, on burnout being more than just a work stress issue. Because when you Google burnout, that's often what comes up. This is a workplace stress issue, but it's a whole of life issue, I think. If we can start to recognize that, if we can start as guys to recognize that we don't need to bottle things up. In fact, we've been conditioned to bottle things up from birth, and we don't need to do that anymore. We can actually say that we're struggling and be okay and not be feel that we're weak or be seen as weak to do that. Then we can start to chip away at this thing called pride and maybe even shame as well. A lot of people, when they experience a mental health condition or a challenge like burnout, shame pops in. They're ashamed to talk about it because maybe, as we said, the generations before them never talked about that, or maybe their best mate is killing it and he seems invincible, or the person next to them in the cubicle next to them seems to be getting all the promotions, and they just want that. They want that. They want that. But if we can just tune back into ourselves and go, what do I need? And for many of us, I think that need is to be seen, be heard, to be able to express without fear of repercussion as well. If we can start to get to that space, I think we might see less instances of burnout and more people just talking about what's going on, and or maybe seeing their GP or maybe seeing a therapist or life coach, or improving their self-care and what they're doing outside of work as well, or study or family or whatever. And so shame, pride, masculinity, social constructs, all these types of things I think influence us. But consumerism, capitalism, context is important. And it's not the same for everybody as well. What you and I experience in terms of burnout is very different to other people in the world. It's different to how, women experience it. It's different to how children experience it, different races, different religions, all that type of stuff. So context is really important. Understanding that who you are at the real core level can go a long way to even understanding why so many people they keep going until they reach burnout. The pressures of family, the pressures of social expectations, their friends' expectations, our own expectations. We put a lot of expectations on ourselves. For me, that was that perfectionist, and I couldn't do it anymore. So yeah, there's lots to it, but I've hopefully shined some light on a few aspects that can maybe people can start reflecting on in their own lives and going, you know what, maybe it is shame for me, or maybe it is pride for me, or maybe yeah, I'm the sole breadwinner at this household at the moment. And how can I reach out for support? And the earlier we can do that, maybe we can stop burnout from happening and identify those red flags a lot earlier to make changes. And that's really important for me now, having experienced burnout, is recognizing when my next burnout's coming. And of being very close. In fact, I probably burnt out a second time since my initial burnout, right at the end of my study and the end of that career that I was in. I was pretty flat and down, and I needed change desperately, which prompted me to resign, which is a weird thing to resign from your job and career. Um, but also, I'm recognizing now as a small business owner and someone who is a therapist now, when burnout is creeping back to me. So, an example right off the bat, when we talked about us trying to get this up and running for a while, was I think it was about 12 months ago, or not even that, where we were going to have this interview or start setting up this interview. I was burning out again. I was exhausted from trying to set up the business, but also as a podcaster myself, doing way too many podcasts. I was podcast burnt out. I know a lot of podcasts don't understand that because it is a hard thing to do. But yeah, it comes and goes, and as long as we can recognize those signs early and have systems in place early, we can hopefully avoid it. Because for me, it was a terrible thing to go through 4 to 5 months sitting on the couch trying to rediscover me. It was a very challenging period in my life.
Yeah, I think when we were trying to schedule an episode, and I remember you said, "Oh, I'm kind of booked out for the next 4 months," and people were saying like, because I was hearing that a lot, especially in the space where people were like, "Oh, I have a backlog of next four months," and they were like, "Oh, but would you not be able to fit in an episode here?" And I'm like, "No, I really respect that people in this space are setting their boundaries." And I
Hmm.
fully respect that. Just because you reach out and try to network with someone and they say, "Oh, I'm all booked up for the next 6 to 12 months," that doesn't mean you cut them off. It's like, okay, I respect that. You're setting your limit, you're setting your boundaries, And yes, we can come back in 12 months. Maybe you'll have a lot more experience in 12 months that you can share with me then. And that was something as well, just in my way of framing a situation and seeing it from another perspective, is that just because I don't make the initial connection right now, and I think that's where the perfectionist and the trying to hustle and achieve more is trying. It's like, no, you close that contact now, or you close that deal now. It's like, no, take a step back, respect where that person is coming from. Does this connection have to happen now, or can you wait some time? If it's really worth it, you can wait some time. And yeah, I think that's something that it takes self reflection and a kind of a higher sense of awareness to take that step back and not feel like you have to rush into everything and hit deadlines and hit targets and everything. Because, especially in the podcast space, that was something that I even felt last year. I hit a stretch goal. I wanted to get 100 guests because, and taking another step back, it was when I started the podcast and people said that they couldn't relate to my burnout story. They were like, Eugene, we know how you are. You're this psychotic person who gets up at 3 a.m. to work out before doing a 12-hour shift. And this was after I had recovered from my burnout because I was trying to prioritize my health while working in the job that I loved. And they were like, look, whatever worked for you is not going to work for me because that it sounds absolutely crazy. So they felt, and I realized then at the time that they were deflecting me and didn't want to talk about it because it was triggering a discomfort in them. So rather than me say, okay, well, I can't relate to anyone around here and people just can't relate to my story, I should stop sharing it. I thought, okay, what if I'm not the only person who feels this way? What if there's someone else out there who feels this way but doesn't know how to share it yet? And I just reached out and I said, look, is there anyone else out there who has ever experienced issues with their mental health in the workplace, ever felt stressed, overwhelmed, or burnt out, and wants to share their story? Because I want to normalize this discussion. I want to create a safe space where people can talk openly about their feelings, about their vulnerabilities. Because once you say it out loud, it becomes more tangible. You don't have that niggling negative self narrative in your head that makes everything, blows everything out of proportion. Once you say it out loud, it's like, okay, it's more tangible. I know how to deal with this now. And that's when I started reaching out. I was like, look, if I can get 100 stories, someone can relate to at least one element of one person's story out of that 100. And it was great. I got to meet so many lovely people, so many different stories, different ways of working, different cultures, very different perspectives, and different ways of recovering as well, and different time spans. And it increased my awareness. But coming up towards the end of last year, I even felt it myself. I was trying to push out 2 episodes every week, and I realized I was hitting my limit again. And it was just that awareness. I'm like, okay, this is what, if I continue like this, I'm going to burn out on the podcast. So I set a limit. I was like, once I hit my 100th episode, I'm taking a break. And I took 2 weeks off, and people were like, oh, do not just push and see how many you can get for the rest of the year. And I'm like, nope, I hit my 100. I'm taking a break for myself rather than just keep on trying to push out content. I was like, no, I need to take a step back, my own awareness, my own time for reflection, and come back recharged and revived and ready to take on 2024. And it's the same when it came to New Year's resolutions. I always going to rant in January about New Year's resolutions. I'm like, stop, guys. You've had Thanksgiving, you've had Christmas, you've had all these social events. You have New Year's, you have more social events for the people that you didn't meet over Christmas. So setting a New Year's resolution in January is not going to help because you're probably going to fall off the wagon 2 weeks in and go like, oh well, I'll wait until next January before setting that goal. And I'm like, you've had so much noise around you for the past 6 to 8 weeks. When have you had the time to just sit in silence with yourself and just self reflect? Take some time for yourself. And that's when I urge people in January, February, take some time to just take a step back and think and self reflect on yourself. How are you feeling? Are you feeling burnt out? Are you feeling stressed in your work? Do you still like your work? What are your values? A lot of people don't know what their true values are. So it's hard to know if you're in or out of alignment. So that's why I always like to start off the year and be like, how am I feeling? What are my values? Are they the same as they were last year? Are they the same as they were 10 years ago? And from that, it's like, okay, where do I want to see myself in 12 months' time? Where do I want to see myself in 5 years' time? And I just feel like that's when burnout happens, is when people just don't take that time to self reflect. They don't realize that they're burning out. They don't realize that they're in the cycle until it's too late, until they don't know how to get off that cycle. And sometimes it could be 5 years, 10 years. They don't realize that they've burnt out before. They just never recognized it for what it was. And just feel like they get lost in that cycle. They don't know how to approach anyone about it. And especially men. Like this is me trying to reel in. I'm always going off on rants, but especially men don't know who to reach out to, and trying to find that network or trying to reach out even to their own group. Sometimes they feel it's going to break their image that they've set up as the breadwinner, as the reliable one, who their kids look up to. They were like, I can't take the time to reflect on myself because I have to take care of everyone else. But my most important question that a lot of people don't like to hear is, but at what cost? If you're showing up and you're a stress ball and you're using all these coping mechanisms to make sure that you can keep showing up for work and keep on showing up on autopilot and numbing those negative emotions, are you also numbing your positive emotions, your enjoyment, how you spend time with your loved ones, how you show up to work, to your friends, to your family? It's like you get stuck at a level of, oh, I've got to keep this level of momentum going no matter what the cost. But you don't look at, well, what about the expense that that's going to have on all the best areas in your life, the people that you're doing it for?
It's funny how you were saying that because particularly around the Christmas stuff is I did 3 episodes over the Christmas New Year on all those points. It was around the reflection piece, it was around values, and it was around purposeful goals using values as well. And interestingly, around that same time, I needed a detox from social media. And you see this a lot in the social media space, people who are grinding, people who are trying to be influencers or even just have businesses who are, promoting through social media. And you see a lot now of people just saying, I'm taking a social media break and or at work, when I was at work and burnout was happening, there was people taking leave for and I'm like, oh, I didn't realize they were taking leave, and I thought they were just going on holidays. But what I came to realize after I burnt out and then I went back to work and shared my story actually of burnout was these people came forward and said, Simon, I was on leave because I was burnt out too. And I think in the workplace particularly, and for guys, but also for women as well in the workplace, there's also, we talked a bit about shame before, and there's this notion that if I share like a mental health story or a burnout story in the workplace, am I going to be missing up on opportunities in the future? Is that going to impact my ability to become a manager or a CEO or change jobs because I'm being seen as broken or whatever? But I like your point there earlier as well around normalizing mental health discussions. And this is the beauty about podcasting is we can normalize mental health discussions, discussions about anything, masculinity, about, there's a lot of talk about healthy versus toxic masculinity, particularly for guys. And, we can talk about burnout. We can talk about, career goals and grinding and hustling and all that type of stuff and shine a light on these issues and become mindful about them. This is what I think mindfulness-based practice is consciously tuning into the way that we're showing up in life, whether it's at work, at home, study, with our friends, and going, you know what, is this serving me? Is this making me feel well? Is it aligning with my values, as you said? Is it achieving the goals that I set out for this year, like meaningful goals? But also, is it me living my best life? Is it me tuning in to the people that I really love around me. And for me, for example, burnout sucks the joy out of you. You become one of the symptoms of it, the most common symptoms is you become very cynical. You don't see the beauty in the world. You don't see like the beautiful blue sky or the beautiful flower or the amazing job somebody did. You just see burnout. You see brain fog, you see stress, you're very quick to anger for some people. You don't feel like there's any purpose in what you do. You're sitting at a workplace and you're doing the job and it just means nothing. Even though you might be really proud of what you do, you might have all the qualifications, you might have status, you might not have any of those things, but it just becomes monotonous. It becomes autopilot life. You're just traveling through life as if like you're in a time machine, but just you're not really present in the moment. And that's another thing. You're never present. You're always on a different planet. And for me, it was always on a different planet. My kids would be jumping up and down in front of me, wanting my attention, but I would be, on a different planet. I wouldn't be present. And so that's what burnout does to you. It places you in positions where you're not there and you're not enjoying life. And so, as we talked about before, if we can catch it earlier, have the right self-care routines in place. And when we say that, it's like exercising, sleep, diet, what addictive substances for me, it was drinking way too much. So I was just numbing both the pain, but probably also the ability to experience joy because I was just drinking a lot. Every other day, what was once a weekend thing became a weeknight thing as well. I wouldn't be like drunk every day, but like on the weekends, I would just drink until I was basically ready to go pass out in bed. And it was just like, I need to numb everything. And then you wake up the next day, anxiety about what, the night before, or, trying to piece the puzzle back together. Um, but it is something that we can recognize, that we can normalize these discussions. We can maybe prompt someone out there listening today to go, you know what, I'm feeling the same, or I've felt similar. Maybe it's time to start talking, because there is healing in talking and sharing our stories. You don't have to do it on a podcast like what we're doing right now. You can just do it to your friend or family member. Your GP or your doctor is a great place to start because they're going to be unbiased. They're going to give you some direction, maybe referral to a therapist or whatever. Um, but healing doesn't have to be something that's weak. It's something that is good. I mean, you think about our physical health. If we were to hurt play some sport and injure our knee, we wouldn't hesitate to go to a doctor, say, "Hey, I've busted my knee. Can you give me some help?" Maybe it's a physio trip, or maybe you need to go get surgery. We wouldn't hesitate to do that. Like, it is a thing that is so normal in our lives. We watch sport on TV, and there's a player that gets a physical injury. It's all over the news, and we're like, oh, hoping, can't wait till he comes back. We wish him well, or her. It's not just guys. We wish them well. We're looking forward, and it's almost in the news cycle every day until they come back onto the field or the court or whatever. Why can't we do the same with mental health? Mental health discussions should be as normal as a physical one. It should be like, okay, I'm struggling mentally. I'm just going to go to the GP and get this sorted. I'm not, I don't feel shame or anything like that, because our mental is as part of the physical. It's all interrelated. When I burnt out, I developed a mysterious back pain. So I was trying to go to the doctor and a specialist. Okay, what's going on with this back pain? And I had all the scans in the world, and no scan showed up anything. And I'm like, and the specialist said to me, Simon, we can go and do surgery, but we don't even know what we're looking for. There's nothing there on the scans. When I did the work on my mental health, the back pain disappeared. This is the first time ever that I've had a physical symptom, like a really physical muscle bone symptom, for a mental health condition. It's the first time ever. Like, I've had mental health conditions, as I said, for a long time, never to this extent. Like, this back pain was excruciating. I couldn't stand up. I couldn't sit. I couldn't lay down. I couldn't do anything without the pain. It was so bad. And I'd never experienced anything like that. So the more we normalize these discussions, the more we just see mental health as much as important as our physical health. You think about it, your brain is the reason that you're able to talk and feel and emote and connect with people, problem solve. Your physical body can't do that. Your physical body is just you getting from A to B. But your mental part of the body it brings around the spiritual side of you, the emotion, the value stuff. Like, that's your brain. You need your brain to do that. So the more we can nurture our brains, by discussing our mental health. It's so weird that we have to say this and we have to beat this into people, but it's so true. Like the more we normalize it, the more we talk about it, the more we normalize it, and the more we normalize it, just the better everybody is for it. And particularly men who for so long have been taught, don't share it, don't talk about it, push through, hustle. We don't need to do that, guys. If we can implore anything from today's episode, you don't need to do that because burnout sucks. Like it's not a good thing to go through. You're not a champion for being burnt out. You're not going to be the number one prize winner and all that type of stuff. You're just going to be burnt out. And that could burn out could it can impact your family, it can impact your friends, your relationships, your work, your study. It impacts everything. And but there is, purpose that can come from it. If you have reached burnout and you're struggling, maybe you're listening to this and you're on that leave, you're on the couch where I was in 2020. Recognize that we can turn this into our purpose. We can actually move forward with this and grow meaningfully, get mindful. You can healing is possible, and in fact, it's possible in almost every case. And once we do that, once we tune into that aspect of ourselves, we can use it for purpose. So I now use it as fuel for my business, my men's mental health business, because I know from personal experience how hard it is to talk about stuff and to be the client on a therapist couch. And when I burnt out, that was also the first time I went to therapy and cried. I'd never cried in therapy before in the 8 years prior, but burnout just took me to that next level. And so let's do it, guys. Let's get together and sort out our mental health. It is a good thing, and you can turn that pain into purpose, like we are right now talking about this. This has become our purpose to share these stories. So, yeah, I go on a bit of a rant about these things too.
I love it. That's the whole point. There's so many times I get in these conversations and people just rant and they vent, and next thing they come out of it and they're like, "Oh, that was actually really really nice." And even some of these podcast episodes, I come on afterwards, and people are like, "It was really nice to just get that off my chest. I never talked about that before," or something like that. Something that came up naturally. It was even in a recent episode. I never talked about something before, but it just came up. We were talking about how when you dull your negative emotions, it also dulls your positive emotions. And it got me thinking to about 6 months before I burnt out. And I was at a Foo Fighter concert. And I was with my friend. And I remember seeing the Foo Fighters 10 years before that. And it was in Ireland. I was about half a mile away from the stage. It was torrential rain. It was just bucketing from the sky, but it was one of the best concerts of my life. It was amazing. And next thing, I was seeing them 6 months before I burnt out, and it was June bank holiday weekend. It was about 25 degrees. I was about 200 yards away from the stage, so close to Dave Grohl, and I felt nothing. There was no buzz, nothing. And my friend just turned to me and he was like, Eugene, are you okay? And I just looked at him and I was like, I'm not feeling any buzz. I wasn't drinking or anything, but usually the music just gets me going. I just really get into rock and metal. But I was just standing there and I was like, I'm here, but I'm not fully present. And I knew something was up. And he was looking at me too. He was like, this is not Eugene. Something is up here. He's like, is everything okay? And I'm like, yeah, I don't know. It was like, I don't know why I'm not feeling this, the music. And it's only in hindsight now, when it just clicked, I was like, oh yeah, I was completely burnt out at that point. But I was just in this living on autopilot, that even
Mm,
when I was out of work and I was meant to be on my vacation and out enjoying myself, I was completely numb to it. And it's only by having these conversations that I was able to tangibly see, oh, that's why I felt that way. And that's how long it had been affecting me. And even when I thought that, oh, I'm working so that I can live this life that I want on my time off, I wasn't able to enjoy that time to the fullest because I did not have the capacity to feel those emotions to their full extent, that I no longer had that capacity. And that was something where I was like, okay, I need to take a step back and make sure that I make the time for myself. And when I do an activity, I enjoy it as openly and as curious and as naively as possible. Just enjoy it like a 5 year old, run around like a toddler in my 30s, and just fully enjoy that experience. Dance like no one is watching. And one of the other things I did notice as well was that in your moments alone, when you're self-reflecting or subconsciously, let's say, mind in different activities, your daily activities, one thing I noticed when I was completely burnt out was that I stopped singing, and like music was my life when I was a kid, and I noticed that even singing in the shower, I was like, oh, I don't even sing in the shower anymore. And it wasn't until I realized that I was more aware of, oh, I'm subconsciously singing in the shower again, or humming or whistling or something. I was like, okay, there's a spark there. There's a bit more light in my life. There's a bit more positivity. I'm starting to feel more again. And it wasn't until those things started to happen naturally that I was like, okay, something's improving here. It's the little things that you feel that used to give you joy in your life. And when you start noticing you're not doing them as often, or, oh, when was the last time I picked up the guitar? Or when was the last time I sang out loud, either in front of someone or singing in the car, and not caring about, am I singing in tune? Just enjoying yourself in the moment and not worrying about how other people are going to react, or it's those little moments that I feel that when we are aware of those little moments and how they bring the small little joys in our life, and once we start to dull them out, that's a big red flag for me. And that was something that I feel when I feel that I was slipping into burnout again. When I feel those little moments coming back, or that I'm like, oh, I'm not singing in the shower as much anymore, that's a red flag. What's changing my life? Where do I need to set a boundary?
But you've also touched on recovery as well. So creativity, like as I said before, like burnout sucks the joy out of your life. And you go on autopilot and you're not grounded, you're not present in the moment. And you've highlighted some points that I did in my recovery. And so creativity was one. And I've got a guitar in the background, and I used to love playing guitar and singing. I used to find I've never really I never really tuned into this, but when I was in my teens, I was in my anxiety was at its peak, my OCD was at its peak, and my depression was at its peak too. When I got a guitar and learnt the guitar and I learned how to sing, I would sing, and I would do that for like an hour, 2 hours, just in my room, just mucking around, and I would always come out of it feeling so much better. But it's not until I've become, I'm 40 now. It's 15, 20 years since that period that I've able to go reflect back and go, it was the creative process. It was the being grounded in the moment, just enjoying that pure fun, that creativity, the music creation, the singing, because that's the singing's also got a bit of breath work in it because you've got to regulate your breathing to be able to sing in any sort of tune. That was a healing thing. I never knew that was a healing thing. I just thought it was just me playing guitar. But when I burnt out in 2020, I was sitting on the couch. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't even watch TV without I was not present even watching TV. I didn't the TV was on, but I wasn't watching it. But I grabbed my computer, so I've got a MacBook Air, so plug hopefully Apple can hear this and give you some money for sponsorship. But on the computer, there's a program called GarageBand. And I've never been a DJ or anything like that, but GarageBand is a program that allows you to put loops of music together and make it sound like a song. And I just felt this need to create and to write, find my spark again, find that joy again, to tune off, and switch off the autopilot and consciously live and feel enjoyment. So I'd sit down on this computer, and for an hour I would just put loops together of different, like, you have a drum beat, a guitar beat, you might have some synthesizers or whatever. And at the end of it, I was like, wow, I created this song, like a 3 to 5 minute song. And I actually liked listening to it. So I started putting it on in the kitchen, and like, but it just didn't feel complete. So I created a YouTube channel and I published it. I'm like, you know what? I want to share this with the world and hope that someone else hears it. And to this day, I think I'm the only person who's ever listened to the songs. But there was a sense of achievement. It was a sense of being grounded in the moment. I was only focused for that hour on the computer creating. So I wasn't working. I wasn't distracted by my phone. I wasn't doing anything. It was just creating music. And then I took it another step, like, I would go for a walk, and walking became very important for me. Every day I would have to do my walk, and I'd have to go for about an hour. Like that was my target every day. And I started finding that I wasn't really being present on the walk. I really wanted to enjoy the walk. So one way to do that was to brush my hand along a tree as I went past it. And the reason behind that is I wanted to feel something. I wanted to feel like I was part of something more than just what's going on in my head. So it helped ground me. And then the more I did that, I started to pick off a few leaves, crunch them in my hand, and smell the aroma on my skin, and this beautiful fresh aroma of the leaves that I was grabbing off this tree. And then that enabled me to start going, okay, what else is there? And I looked up into the sky. So usually I walk down with my head down, my eyes down, and there's two reasons for that. One is that I get a lot of anxiety, and I don't like looking at other people, and there's a lot of historical stuff there associated with my OCD. The second part was also I don't like stepping in dog shit. So so I'm always looking down so I don't step on dog shit. It's a childhood trauma that keeps coming up for me. But I wanted to look up and stop looking at the pavement. And so I started looking above the trees, and well, I started looking at the trees in the distance actually. And I started noticing that the trees were all swaying on the breeze. And but it wasn't uniform. There was one branch going one way, one branch going another way. So it kind of like looked like they were dancing on the wind. I'm like, oh, that's cool. And I was really just watching it. Like I was watching it like I was looking at a painting in a gallery, and I was picking it apart, like all the colors, all the brush strokes, everything. And then I'd look up higher and I go, okay, look how blue that sky is, and started really appreciating the vibrancy of the sky. And then the clouds, like if it was a white or dark cloud, and all this. So I started unpacking nature essentially, and using my five senses to really come into the moment. And I found that started to lift me up. So I had the creative piece with the garage band program. Then I had the grounding piece with nature, and I just started to feel well again. I started to feel better in myself. And so the next challenge was to be present with the kids and my wife. And often I'd be driving. I'm the driver, like most guys are. We jump in the car, we jump in the driver's seat, and everyone would be talking around me and the radio would be on, but I'm just like not present there. So I started using my senses again. I started really using my hand on the steering wheel to really tune in. Okay, I'm here. I'm in the car. The radio's on. There's a great song, so let's sing it. Let's get creative. Kids love a bit of a sing along in the car. So we started doing that. Or if kids were talking to me and my wife would be like, Simon, Simon, they're talking to you. I'd grip onto that steering wheel really hard just to feel it in my hands, like to actually be present with it. And then I'm like, okay, I'm here now. I can tune back into what they're saying to me. So these are ways that we can recover, is we can get creative. We can use our five senses to ground ourselves. And the more we can ground ourselves in the moment is really important, because I had this great quote once on my podcast, is the more we think about the past, we it leads to things like depression, to guilt, to shame, to regret, all these types of things. But the more we think of the future, and we often do this, we think about the past and the future, it leads to anxiety and stress and worry and what if, what's going to happen, all these types of things. But all we can really do, we can't influence what happened in the past because it's happened. We can't influence what's going to happen in the future. We can have a bit of a direction towards it, but we don't know what's going to happen. The more, life is about being in the present moment, like having this conversation with you right now, or for a listener listening to this conversation right now, wherever they are in the world, whatever they're doing, or it's walking along that path and brushing your hand along the bush, or it's being on the beach. I do this at the beach a lot as well. It's like digging your toes into the sand and just really tuning into everything happening around you, being present with your partner or your kids or your friends, really tuning into what they're saying. And the more we can do that without things like alcohol, drugs, all those types of things, and really just be present in that moment, um, it starts to improve our well-being. It improves our relationships. It improves our sense of direction and purpose in life. It improves the happiness, the joy. It brings all that back. And so these are all mindfulness-based practices that are also just everyday common sense things that we often overlook when we're on autopilot. We don't tune into any of this type of stuff. We're on life on autopilot. We're just doing the same old groundhog day, day after day after day. Conscious living is the best drug in the world. It's the best way to just be present, be well, heal, have great relationships, and find that meaning in life that we often lose when we're burnt out or struggling with another mental health condition.
Amen. Simon, when you, let's say, your Mindful Men podcast,
Hmm.
do you also create a community for men to become mindful?
Yeah, so anybody who touches, or let's say touch, that's a bit of a weird thing, but everyone who comes in contact with mindful men, I feel is part of the community. So even though this is your podcast, I feel you're part of the mindful men community. We're talking about mindfulness. We're encouraging men to be mindful. So it's the podcast, it's the Mindful Men podcast, it's the social media, it's my website, it's the networking I do around the world. So I network a lot in Australia, but also online around the world, which is fantastic. There is a Facebook group that people can come in and be part of a growing community of mindful men. So in that well, I put posts in there around mindfulness, like on a Monday, what is mindfulness? And we talk about different topics. So, for example, this week's topic was digital detoxing. And we've talked a bit about that today on social media and stuff like that. A few weeks ago it was around time management and stress management. So there's a whole range of topics that we talk about. I bring in snippets of the podcast, but also just allowing guys to tune in and check in with themselves as well. We are looking at in the future some men's groups, whether they're online and also in community as well. But it is more than just the podcast. It's everything. It's connection and you and I are now mindful men. We're talking about mindfulness stuff. We're talking about burnout. We're now part of each other's networks as well. So the more I do this all over the world, and it's a really fantastic thing. There are big plans for mindful men to have people and spaces all over the world. At the moment, it's just me in Australia, but that's the beauty of online, isn't it? We can do this online via Zoom or Riverside or wherever, what platform we're using, and it's a fantastic thing. So yeah, it's more than just the podcast. It's a range of different things.
Yeah, that's what I love about the podcast because I always have guests and I always ask what's the best way for them to get in touch with listeners. And it's not that I'm like, oh, you're stealing all my listeners. It's like, no, you got to realize that not a lot of men are talking about this, especially in podcasts. If I type burnout into Spotify or Apple, there not a lot of men come up talking about burnout. And I want more men to talk, be more open and normalize talking about burnout. So the more of us that can open up about this and be vulnerable about this, the more we can normalize that discussion. And the more I talk about it, the more men I've had approach me saying, like, you know what, I actually felt that way too. Do you mind if we have, a quick chat? Do you mind if I just, vent a bit? I'm like, vent. Like, I'm not recording this conversation, just vent. Makes it a lot more tangible to talk about those emotions too. So the more communities that we can create, the more exposure that men have to, oh, it's normal for me to talk about my feelings. It's normal for me to be able to load this onto someone else, to get someone to share this burden and realize, okay, it's not as heavy a weight as I thought. It's not as much of a burden as I thought. Once I got it off my chest, it became more tangible. There's actually something I can do about this, and I can show up as a better person to all the people that I care about. So it's by creating these spaces, the more of these spaces that we can create, Simon, the more people will be able to help. So I'm all for it. We can create mindful men all across the globe.
Absolutely. And you touched on something there, like there's also horses for courses. So someone might not resonate with your story or my story, but they might come into the mindful men community. For example, this week I released an episode on burnout and stress and breath work. So we've talked on this episode around therapy and just talking about stuff. We've talked a bit about grounding and creativity. There's other ways that you can manage things like stress and burnout as well. And so that episode, for example, the guest was a guy sharing his story around burnout, but also how breath work helped him. And so there's all these different modalities that you can use to help yourself, whether it's talk therapy, whether it's medication, whether it's breath work, art therapy, music therapy, going out for bushwalks, getting into men's circles, going camping, all sorts of different activities that you can do to heal. But also, there's so many guys out there. We just got to find them. We got to bring them out to the surface that have different stories that might resonate with you. So, my story is one of mental health, of public service work, of getting into becoming a therapist. Whereas that other guy that I spoke to, he was an accountant, and so he shares his story of being an accountant and then being a dad and all sorts. So we all have our unique stories that bring a different light onto things like burnout and mental health as well. And so it's about finding your tribe as well. Whether or not you're a mindful man or whatever, you could be anything. There's so many different groups out there that are accessible. We sometimes we just got to bury our pride and go, you know what, I am going to join a group and be part of something. But it's not scary once you're in there. Like the scariest part of just making the decision and joining something or doing something about it. But once you start doing it, as we've said a few times, it just becomes easier and easier and easier. The more you talk, the more you do. And yeah, welcome anybody who is listening to come into the Mindful Men community. But also recognize that, it's just not our voices that are in as part of this conversation. There's so many voices out there. Find what works for you and do what works for you, because that's the best way to look at it as well.